A passenger spilled hot coffee on a black baby and mocked the father, but what he did next turned the whole flight into a lesson on respect. He thought humiliating a family would go unnoticed. He didn't realize the man he mocked carried more power than anyone on board. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets its consequence. The coffee struck before anyone had time to react. A flash of motion, a glint of liquid midair, and then a piercing cry tore through the cabin. The scalding coffee poured directly onto the baby's small lap, soaking the blanket, steam rising as if the air itself recoiled from the act. For a split second, everything froze. The hum of the engines, the quiet chatter of passengers, even the clink of utensils from the galley seemed to vanish. Then came the sound no parent ever forgets, the scream of a child in pain. Marcus Dellen's world shrank to that sound. His chest tightened, heart pounding against his ribs as he tore the soaked blanket away, revealing Noah's red, blistered skin. Panic surged through him like lightning. "Help! Somebody, please, he's burned!" His voice cracked with urgency. Around him, passengers twisted in their seats, startled, some standing, others too shocked to move. Across the aisle, Trenton Vale merely leaned back, expression composed, as if he had swatted away a fly. "That'll quiet him," he muttered, voice low but unmistakably deliberate. His tone wasn't one of apology. It was satisfaction, venom disguised as calm. The words landed heavier than the coffee itself. Marcus stared at him, disbelief and fury colliding behind his trembling eyes. "You did that on purpose," he said, voice trembling, the kind of trembling that came not from fear, but from restraint. Trenton shrugged, pretending nonchalance, his expensive cufflinks catching the cabin light. "Maybe you should learn to control your noise," he replied. Noah wailed again, his cries echoing through the cabin. Marcus tried to focus. He needed water, cloth, anything cool. He reached toward the aisle, calling out for assistance. The nearest flight attendant, Derek Voss, appeared, his expression polished but uncertain, the kind of professional mask that faltered under pressure. "Sir, what's happening here?" he asked, voice clipped with the tone of someone trained to manage situations, not people. Marcus pointed to the soaked seat and the steaming cup that had rolled onto the floor. "He poured boiling coffee on my son." The accusation rang through the air like a verdict. Derek's eyes darted to Trenton, then to Marcus, measuring which man carried more power. His voice softened, but toward the wrong person. "Sir," he said to Trenton, "are you all right?" That single sentence shattered Marcus's fragile control. "He's all right?" "My baby is burned." He turned back toward Noah, trying to soothe him, whispering softly, "It's okay, Noah. Daddy's here." But the burns were already visible, angry red blotches spreading across delicate skin. He felt a cold sweat break along his neck as guilt mingled with rage. Passengers began murmuring, phones discreetly lifted to record. One young man across the aisle whispered, "Did he really do that?" Another replied, "I saw it. He just tipped it." Yet the cabin's silence still carried an undertone of disbelief, as if people were afraid to acknowledge what they'd seen. Trenton smirked faintly, glancing around as though the entire incident were a mere inconvenience. "It was an accident," he said with a feigned sigh. "Turbulence, you know. If he can't handle a flight, maybe he shouldn't bring a child on one." His voice carried enough arrogance to fill the cabin. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair rattling against the floor. The baby's cry pierced deeper now, fragile but alive. He could feel every heartbeat pulse through his fingertips as he reached for the call button again. "I need medical attention now." Derek hesitated, voice faltering. "Sir, please sit down. We're experiencing mild turbulence." "Turbulence didn't aim a cup," Marcus snapped, his tone raw but controlled. Around them, the hum of the engines grew louder, a mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo the growing tension. Trenton's calm began to waver. He shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the armrest, annoyed rather than remorseful. "You're overreacting," he muttered. "If it was that hot, you'd both be screaming." His words were a spark tossed onto gasoline. Marcus's breathing slowed, not in calm, but in calculation. He knew that lashing out would only feed Trenton's arrogance. His mind replayed the scene again and again, the deliberate tilt of the wrist, the flicker of satisfaction in Trenton's eyes. This wasn't turbulence, it was intent. One of the passengers, an older man with gray hair and a weathered face, leaned forward from 2 rows back. "That's enough," he said quietly but firmly. "The baby's hurt. Someone get ice." His name tag, probably from a work conference, read Mr. Corrin. His calm defiance carried more authority than the entire crew combined. Derek finally moved, fumbling with a drawer, pulling out a small packet of burn gel from the first aid kit. "Here, sir. Apply this gently." Marcus accepted it with a nod, though his eyes never left Trenton. Every second that passed deepened the weight of what had just occurred. Noah's cries softened into small, painful whimpers as Marcus pressed the gel gently on his skin. The texture was cool against the heat of the burns, but it did little to ease the father's anguish. "You're okay, son. I've got you," he whispered. Yet beneath those words, a vow formed quietly, one that Trenton could not hear. Derek returned to the galley, clearly uncomfortable, whispering something to another attendant who peeked nervously toward row 4. The whispers spread, about status, about blame, about who would be protected. The hierarchy of power had already begun to tilt, and Marcus could feel it. Trenton picked up his laptop, pretending to resume work, but Marcus noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the kind that came not from fear, but arrogance unchecked. "You'll regret this," Trenton murmured without looking up. Marcus straightened, eyes cold. "No," he replied quietly. "You will." The engines roared as the aircraft leveled off, sunlight breaking through clouds and flooding the cabin in gold. Yet the warmth meant nothing now. The air was thick with unspoken judgment, with fear, with the knowledge that something irreparable had begun. Passengers avoided meeting Marcus's gaze, caught between sympathy and hesitation. The coffee stain on the carpet had already dried into the shape of a spreading shadow, dark, uneven, impossible to ignore. As Noah drifted into exhausted sobs, Marcus stared at the man across from him, memorizing his face, his smirk, his carelessness. Every instinct told him this moment would not end on this flight. The incident was over, but the fight had only begun. Trenton finally looked up, sensing the stare, and smiled faintly, almost amused. "Don't take it so seriously," he said, adjusting his tie. "It's just coffee." Marcus didn't answer. His silence was colder than words could ever be. He placed a hand on his son's chest, feeling the small heartbeat steady again beneath his fingers, and whispered, almost to himself, "That'll quiet him," Trenton muttered coldly, unaware that he had just ignited a war. The cry was sharp, immediate, and soul-piercing. Marcus jerked upright, the sound of his infant son's agony slicing through the low hum of the aircraft. The steaming coffee had already soaked into Noah's onesie, and the baby writhed in Marcus's arms, screaming in pain. Without hesitation, Marcus peeled back the soaked blanket. The sight stopped his breath. Noah's tiny thighs were a mottled red, the skin already puckering with the beginnings of blisters. For a heartbeat, the world collapsed into that scream. "Help!" Marcus shouted, his voice raw with panic. "I need medical assistance now." But before a single crew member could respond, Trenton Vale, seated smugly across the aisle, leaned in and shoved Marcus backward. The blow sent him crashing against the seat. Noah jostled violently in his arms. The baby's bottle flew from the armrest and bounced down the aisle, rolling into the shadows beneath the seat. Gasps rippled from the nearby rows. A man in 5C ducked his head. Someone else reached for a call button, but not fast enough. Derek Voss, the sharply dressed flight attendant with a jaw set too tightly, appeared within moments, eyes scanning the scene. His gaze landed on Trenton's tailored jacket and silver wristwatch. Then on Marcus, crumpled, eyes wild, clutching a screaming baby. "Sir," Derek said firmly, tone clipped, "I need you to calm down." Marcus blinked. "He poured coffee on my son." His voice cracked. "He just burned a baby, and you're telling me to calm down?" Derek's lips thinned. "You're escalating this. Please, lower your voice." The words hit harder than Trenton's shove. Marcus could barely process it. He'd seen injustice before, but never like this. His son was in pain. His arms trembled trying to hold both rage and tenderness at once, and the airline crew was defending the man who had just assaulted a child. The betrayal stunned him into silence. A flicker of motion. From across the aisle, Trenton leaned closer, his voice dripping contempt. "Accidents happen," he said, smiling faintly. "Especially when people don't belong here." That sentence shattered whatever self-control Marcus still held. His teeth clenched, jaw twitching. Around them, silence had overtaken the cabin, an eerie hush filled with the weight of withheld judgment. No one moved, no one spoke. Then a cough broke the stillness. An elderly man in the aisle seat a row ahead turned, his face weathered and resolute. He extended a damp cloth across the aisle without saying a word. Marcus reached out and took it. "Cool it fast," the man said quietly, eyes flicking toward the child's burns. "Don't wait." "I've seen worse. It scars less if you act now." Marcus's eyes met his, firm, kind, unafraid. A stranger's defiance, spoken without fanfare. Nodding in silent gratitude, Marcus pressed the cloth gently to Noah's legs, wincing at his son's fresh cry. The pain was real, the burns spreading like a curse, but in that small moment of care, Marcus gathered himself. He looked down. His tray table still held the half-empty coffee cup, the liquid now pooling into the corner of a napkin. His passport sat beside it, half-soaked, the navy blue cover now a murky blend of ink and steam. The gold crest had begun to fade. He picked it up slowly. The leather was hot, sticky. As he held it in his palm, a wave of clarity passed through him. Not rage, but resolve. He laid the passport flat again on the tray, directly into the coffee puddle. He stared at it, letting it soak. All around, the atmosphere was shifting. The other passengers, silent until now, began turning their heads, watching, whispering. Derek took a step closer, more nervous this time. "Sir, if you don't calm down, I'll be forced to—" "Do what?" Marcus said, his voice low but level now. "Force me to sit down while he pours another drink?" Derek flinched slightly but didn't respond. Trenton sat back in his seat with a smirk, folding his arms as though nothing had happened. His confidence was infuriating, too rehearsed to be natural. Something about the way he carried himself, his ease with power, his expectation of immunity, told Marcus that this wasn't the first time Trenton had crossed a line, but it might be the last. Marcus's fingers left the cloth on Noah's lap and curled into a fist, not out of rage but determination. He wasn't going to be silent. Not here. Not while his son's scream still echoed in his ears. He rose again, slower this time. Not frantic, not shouting. He stood tall. His gaze scanned the passengers now watching. Some turned away. Others held his stare. He didn't ask for help. He didn't need it. He spoke without raising his voice. He had no idea what kind of man he'd just provoked. The captain's voice cracked through the intercom, announcing turbulence. But the shaking in row 4 had nothing to do with wind. Marcus sat rigid in his seat, one arm wrapped protectively around Noah, the other gripping the frayed edge of a burp cloth soaked in cooling water. The faint burn marks on Noah's thighs were already reddening, angry and raw, his cries now reduced to whimpers. But it wasn't just pain that tightened Marcus's jaw, it was what he had seen in Trenton's eyes. That smirk, that deliberate tilt of the cup, the venom masked as indifference. "Sir, we need you to calm down," Derek Voss said again, standing stiffly in the aisle, his smile barely holding beneath the weight of the unfolding disaster. "I need a medical kit," Marcus replied through clenched teeth, his voice shaking. Not from fear, but fury he was forcing to stay buried. "And I need you to stop pretending you didn't see what just happened." Derek glanced at Trenton, who had leaned back into his seat like royalty surveying his court. "It was turbulence," the man said smoothly. "He overreacted." Marcus's breath caught. He poured it on my baby." His tone cracked at the word baby. That wasn't turbulence. That was assault. Trenton leaned toward the man behind him, a bespectacled businessman in a gray blazer. "He lunged at me first." "Got aggressive," Trenton whispered loud enough to be heard. "Dangerous type. I could tell the moment I boarded." The man nodded nervously. Marcus heard it. So did the young man seated diagonally across the aisle, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The lie began to move through the cabin, soft and poisonous. A ripple of doubt. A few passengers murmured behind cupped hands. One of them reached up and pressed the call button, but no one came. In the narrow galley behind first class, two younger male attendants, Jalen and Eric, stood frozen beside a service cart. "That scream wasn't turbulence," Jalen said quietly, his hands trembling as he held a small ice pack. "We should report this," Eric said. "The baby's injured." But Derek's voice cut through the corridor like a whip. "We handled this internally." "Understood?" Both men nodded, silenced by protocol and fear. Jalen slid the ice pack back into its compartment. Neither moved. Back in 4A, Marcus noticed something strange. Trenton had pulled out a sleek laptop, the screen glowing faintly with a corporate dashboard. On its metallic lid was a logo Marcus recognized instantly. A silver triangle overlaid with curved wings. Solaire Group. A sick weight settled in his chest. Solaire wasn't just the parent company of Horizon Air, it controlled it. And Trenton Vale wasn't just a passenger. He was an executive. Of course they're protecting him, Marcus thought grimly. It wasn't just arrogance, it was power. He wasn't some entitled traveler. He was a shadow pulling strings mid-air, confident that the world below couldn't touch him. Marcus reached into the diaper bag beneath his seat, pretending to retrieve a pacifier. Instead, he slid out his phone and opened the camera app, angling it subtly toward the aisle. He pressed record. "Is he filming me now?" Trenton's voice cut in again, louder this time. "That's a violation of privacy." "You violated my child's safety," Marcus answered quietly, his tone like a blade sheathed in velvet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Derek stepped forward, hand outstretched. "Sir, please put the phone away." "No," Marcus said. The refusal hung in the air, charged and final. Derek blinked. He turned toward Trenton, searching for direction. And there it was. Trenton gave a small nod, barely perceptible. A cue. Marcus's stomach turned. Even now, mid-crisis, the flight crew wasn't acting independently. They were following someone else's rhythm. On his phone screen, Marcus saw Trenton glance toward him and sneer. "This is why we don't mix coach with business." No control, no Class A voice crackled over the intercom again, reminding passengers to remain seated with belts fastened. Outside the windows, clouds blurred as the plane hit another bump of air. But inside, the storm was silent, palpable. Marcus continued filming. Derek turned sharply and whispered something into the phone at the steward's station. His eyes darted toward Marcus, then quickly away. In that moment, Marcus realized something. They weren't just trying to suppress a situation. They were documenting their own version of it. Internal logs, selective reports, witnesses who would say what they were told to say. Protocol dressed up as fairness. He shifted slightly in his seat, angling the camera more directly now. Noah let out another whimper, softer this time. Marcus held him closer, resting his cheek gently against the baby's head. "Hang in there, little man," he whispered. "We're not done." Back in the galley, Jalen couldn't stay still. This doesn't feel right. It's above our pay grade, Eric replied. You saw the logo. You really want to be on the record against one of their execs? I don't care about his logo, Jalen muttered. I care that a baby screamed like he was on fire. But neither moved. In the aisle, Marcus continued recording as Trenton opened a chat window on his laptop and began typing. Marcus couldn't see the screen clearly, but he captured the moment, time-stamped and clear, the cursor blinking, the smirk on Trenton's face, the relaxed stretch of his legs as if the trial was already won. Marcus knew this footage might not matter in the air, but it would matter on the ground, and he would make sure of that. Yet a deeper truth pressed at his thoughts. This wasn't just about his son. This was a pattern, a test, an observation of how far someone could be pushed without snapping, a stress test, using real passengers as the subjects. And if that were true, then the flight crew's behavior wasn't just negligent, it was orchestrated. He glanced down at his phone. The minutes were stacking up, each clip a sliver of truth. Each second, a blade of light cutting through the fog. Then, as if on cue, Trenton leaned back, arms folded, and spoke just loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear. Some people don't belong in first class. That's all I'm saying. Marcus didn't respond. He didn't move. But his eyes met Trenton's across the aisle, and there was no fear left in them. He pressed stop on the recording, saved the file, and whispered to himself, barely audible like a prayer sealed in steel, "When justice is delayed, at 30,000 feet, the sky itself becomes the courtroom." Trenton's fist struck Marcus's jaw with a sharp, cracking thud. The sound echoed through the cabin like the crack of a snapped branch in a quiet forest, sudden, brutal, and final. Marcus staggered back into the aisle, one arm instinctively twisting to shield the infant cradled against his chest. Passengers gasped, seatbelts clinked as bodies shifted in alarm, and the hum of the Noah's scream split the moment, high-pitched and primal. It wasn't just pain, it was fear, pure and unfiltered, slicing through the artificial calm of the pressurized cabin. Trenton stood tall, his chest heaving with self-satisfaction, brushing his sleeve where it had touched Marcus. "That's what happens when you forget your place," he muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Julian Marone, still standing 2 rows back, was frozen in shock. His hands trembled, his knuckles white from gripping the seat in front of him. Did you all see that?" he stammered. His voice cracked, not with fear, but with a rising clarity of conscience. Derek Voss rushed forward, expression twisted in conflict, one hand raised like a referee too late to stop the blow. "Sir, sit down now," he barked, but the command fell into a vortex of chaos. Marcus didn't speak. He didn't return the punch. Instead, he knelt beside the spilled coffee on the tray table, his fingers slowly reaching for the tattered remains of his passport. The document was soaked, edges curling, the emblem of his country melted into the bitter stain. A quiet fury gathered behind his eyes. He didn't look at Trenton. He didn't need to. Suddenly, the aircraft lurched violently. Turbulence slammed through the fuselage, rattling every loose tray and cup. A coffee pot clattered to the floor. Overhead, bins creaked. Someone screamed in the back. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked to life, casting a pulsing red glow across the rattled expressions of those nearby. Trenton stumbled into the bulkhead and swore under his breath, steadying himself on the seatback. The turbulence had stolen his advantage. Derek turned on Marcus. "Stop! I'm going to have to restrain you if—" Julian stepped forward, blocking him. "If you restrain anyone, it should be him," he said, pointing directly at Trenton. "That man assaulted a father." In front of a baby, Derek's mouth opened, but before he could argue, 2 other male passengers rose. One from row 5, a heavy-set man in a dark polo, and another from row 7, lean with a mechanic's jacket. "We saw it, too," the man in the jacket said. "You gonna detain all of us?" Derek faltered. Marcus stood slowly, cradling Noah with one arm. Blood traced down his chin from where Trenton's punch had split his lip. With the other hand, he lifted his ruined passport, staring at the symbol embossed on the front as if seeing it for the first time. His eyes hardened, not from rage, but clarity. He dipped the document into the puddle of spilled coffee still smoldering on Trenton's tray. The thick, dark liquid clung to it like ink to shame. The blue bled into brown, the gold lettering dulling as if the very notion of identity had been soaked through with betrayal. From his coat pocket, Marcus drew a torn corner of his boarding pass, folded and soft from use. He ripped it fully in half with a slow, deliberate motion and stepped forward. Trenton, now panting, backed away half a step, confusion flickering across his face. Marcus dropped both halves of the boarding pass onto Trenton's chest. They slid off like falling ash. The lighter clicked once. The tiny flame caught the edge of a napkin. It flared briefly, small, harmless, but bright enough to cast dancing shadows across their faces. Gasps erupted. A passenger fumbled for a nearby extinguisher. Another shouted for calm. Derek lunged forward only to be blocked again by Julian. "No," Julian said. "You don't get to silence this moment." The cabin was a theater of eyes. Every gaze fixed on the fire, the father, the silence that was no longer silent. For a fleeting second, nothing else existed. Then the extinguisher hissed, smothering the flame. The smoke curled like the last whisper of a secret too long kept. Noah whimpered, but quieter now, his tiny fists clutching his father's collar. Marcus didn't blink. He leaned slightly toward Trenton, whose smugness had curdled into unease. His voice, low and steady, slid beneath the din like steel beneath silk. "If paper burns easier than justice," Marcus said, "let it start with yours." Then he struck the lighter from his pocket. The flame was small, but its meaning was infinite. The flame flared for less than 10 seconds, but it was long enough. A thin line of fire danced atop the tray table, licking the edges of the soaked passport and torn ticket. Its glow reflected in Marcus's eyes, but his gaze was fixed not on the flame, but on the man across from him, the one who had poured boiling coffee on his son, and still hadn't looked remorseful. Around them, panic ignited. "Fire!" "He lit something," a passenger shouted from a few rows back. The scream was enough to set the cabin into motion. A flight attendant bolted from the galley, knocking against a cart as he rushed forward with a fire extinguisher. He didn't pause. He raised the nozzle and let the white cloud erupt over the tray. A sharp hiss filled the air as the tiny flame was smothered, steam and smoke curling upward like a breath released after too long held in. Marcus didn't move. He cradled Noah tighter against his chest, whispering softly to calm the child as startled cries rippled through the cabin. His free hand gripped the phone, still recording. His knuckles were white. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but out of sync with the chaos below. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing mild turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Turbulence. That was all they'd acknowledge? Derek Voss rushed forward, face tight with manufactured professionalism. He pointed at Marcus. "You're done. We need restraints now." Before the order could be executed, a figure stepped into the aisle. Julian Maron, the bespectacled young man who had earlier dared to speak truth into the silence, planted himself between Marcus and Derek. His voice was unwavering. "You'll restrain the wrong man." Derek hesitated. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. From across the aisle, Trenton suddenly lunged, aiming straight for Marcus's phone. His hand clawed through the air, furious and desperate. But Marcus anticipated him. With a subtle sidestep, he let Trenton's momentum carry him forward, too far. Trenton crashed into the aisle. The sound was jarring. His shoulder hit first, followed by his hip, and then his elbow smacked the corner of the service cart. It tipped violently, ejecting a rain of plastic utensils, creamer packets, and aluminum food trays that clattered across the floor in all directions. For a breathless second, the entire cabin froze. Noah whimpered. Marcus stood tall. A voice rose from the back of the plane. Firm, commanding. "He's right. Record everything." And then, like dominoes, phones lifted into the air. Dozens of screens pointed toward the aisle. Passengers, men who had sat in silence moments ago, now held up their devices, capturing the unraveling truth from every angle. Derek turned, stunned, watching the passengers turn against him. Panic crept into his jawline. His voice cracked as he tried to speak. "You can't." But no one listened. The intercom buzzed again. "This is your captain speaking. Due to an onboard incident, we are initiating emergency landing procedures at the nearest available airport. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin." The message landed like a verdict. Marcus let out a long breath, his chest rising and falling with quiet control. The fury that had once driven him had cooled into something sharper, something finished. He bent slightly and kissed Noah's forehead, speaking low and clear, a voice only a child could hear. "You're safe now, son." Outside the window, the clouds parted as if in reverence. A stretch of land emerged beneath them, solid, waiting. Below lay consequence. Above, truth rode its descent. The fire had long been extinguished, but its meaning remained. The storm outside couldn't rival the one that had already broken within the cabin. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt, metal shrieking beneath the weight of Flight 218 as it screeched into an emergency landing at Halvern Field. But inside the cabin, the real turbulence hadn't ended. It had only begun to descend with them. Marcus Dellon sat motionless, his arms cradling Noah against his chest like a shield. The infant whimpered in pain, his burned legs trembling under the gauze and cloth Julian had managed to find in the seat back. Smoke from the extinguished flame still lingered in the air, thin tendrils curling up through the cabin lights, mixing with the sterile pressurized air and the electric tension that no ventilation system could clear. "Sir, you'll need to hand over the device now," Derek Voss said, approaching quickly, voice brittle with fear, but still trying to wield control like a blade. He extended a gloved hand toward Marcus's phone, the one that had caught Trenton's sneer, the punch, the burned skin of a baby. Marcus didn't move. He looked past Derek, not at him, his voice level and cool. "Step back." Trenton's voice exploded from the front, still full of arrogance and bluster. "This is an outrage. I'm a director at Solaire Group. Do you people know who I am?" He had stood up, tie loosened, hair disheveled from the struggle, but his eyes still gleaming with the entitlement of someone who'd never been held accountable. No one responded. Phones were everywhere now. Nearly half the passengers had theirs out, silently recording, documenting every moment like courtroom clerks. No one dared speak. They let the cameras speak for them. Then the cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss. 4 officers in black uniforms stepped aboard briskly. Their boots hit the carpeted aisle with synchronized steps, faces unreadable. The lead officer's name tag read, H. Brenner. His eyes scanned the row numbers, noting the collapsed food cart, the broken coffee mug, the blood on Marcus's lip, and the bruises blossoming across his jaw. "Step aside," Officer Brenner ordered firmly as Derek began to speak. "We'll assess the situation." Derek tried again. "I need to explain." A calm but firm voice cut across him. "Check the child first." Everyone turned. It was Julian Marin. He stepped into the aisle, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging in his body. He didn't look afraid. He looked resolved. Brenner nodded. 2 officers moved toward Marcus. He didn't flinch. He gently peeled back the edge of the cloth around Noah's legs, revealing the raw, red blisters. The youngest officer, a man no older than 30, visibly swallowed. His hand curled into a fist by his thigh. "Sir," Brenner said carefully, "what happened here?" Marcus lifted his phone and held it out. "He poured that on my son. Then he punched me when I stood up silence." Trenton burst forward. "Lies! This whole flight is out of control. He came at me. I was defending myself. One of the officers gestured for him to step back. We'll review the evidence. Trenton waved his arms. I want legal counsel. This is absurd. Brenner turned to Marcus. And you have this on video? Marcus nodded, pressing play. They watched. The footage began with Trenton muttering, "That'll quiet him," before tipping the coffee cup. The baby's scream followed, wrenching even in digital playback. Then the punch, then the scuffle. Then Derek's voice clearly telling Marcus to calm down, while Trenton stood untouched. It was damning. "Enough," said Brenner. He motioned to his men. "Detain him." "What? You can't." Trenton backed away, only to be caught by two officers. "You are not under arrest," Brenner clarified coldly. "But you are being detained for questioning under federal aviation law and assault investigation." Trenton fought, voice rising. "I'm calling my attorney. I'll bury this plane in litigation." But no one listened. As Trenton was escorted down the aisle, passengers moved aside in silence. Not a word, not a sound. Only the mechanical click of handcuffs being fastened. Derek stepped forward, his voice desperate. "This isn't protocol." "He's a senior officer. We have procedures." Brenner turned, his voice steel. "You've said enough." Derek froze, face pale, hands at his sides. Marcus remained seated, head bowed slightly, as Noah finally drifted into a light sleep against his chest, exhausted from pain and panic. Julian sat back down quietly, the adrenaline fading from his limbs as his chest rose and fell with shallow, steady breaths. Outside the window, the tarmac buzzed with movement, emergency vehicles lined up, reporters held back behind airport security tape, and a single ambulance waited, engine running, back doors wide open. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. Not just because the shouting had stopped, but because something larger had happened. Something unspoken. Authority had shifted. A father had become a witness. A victim had become a voice. And for once, a man with power had been walked off a plane not with applause, but with the weight of justice pressing on his shoulders. Brenner looked at Marcus, then down at Noah. "We'll have paramedics here in under 2 minutes," he said. Marcus nodded once. The plane's engines quieted, leaving only the hum of air vents and the far-off whine of a siren approaching the gate. Brenner turned to his officers. "Secure the footage, log the statements. We treat this like a criminal assault. No leniency." Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He could still hear Trenton's words, still smell the coffee in his son's clothes, still feel the sting in his jaw. But none of it shook him. Not anymore. He had stayed upright. He had not lashed out. And now, finally, the world had seen. The cabin, once a space of power imbalance, had transformed. Now, the bruises told the truth. The footage told the truth. And no corporate badge could twist that. Passengers stared out the windows or down at their phones, still rolling, still witnessing. And in that moment, Marcus knew the flight wasn't over. Not by air, but by principle. He would not let this end in silence. And as the officers guided Trenton off the plane, as Derek stood trembling and speechless, as Noah breathed softly in his father's arms, the weight of justice felt real, heavy, and necessary. Sometimes, the truth lands harder than the plane itself. Trenton Vale screamed over his shoulder as 2 security officers escorted him toward the terminal's side hallway, his voice cracking with fury. "This is a violation. I demand you call your supervisor." The medics ignored him, focused entirely on the infant in Marcus Dellen's arms. Noah whimpered, his tiny legs blistered and trembling. One medic gently touched the burn area with gloved fingers while the other prepared a cooling gel wrap, eyes narrowing at the severity. Marcus said nothing. He stood in the middle of the terminal like an unmoving pillar. Blood dried along the edge of his lip from Trenton's punch. Noah pressed carefully against his shoulder. His silence unsettled everyone. Airline staff whispered near the gate. Representatives in navy blazers and name tags rushed in from a nearby office, glancing nervously between the scattered passengers, police, and news cameras gathering outside the glass. "Mr. Dellon," one of them began, holding a clipboard like a shield, "we want to assure you that Horizon Air is treating this matter with the utmost—" "Save it," Marcus said flatly, his eyes still on Noah. Across the terminal, Derek Voss stood behind a rope barrier, arms crossed tightly. He was still in uniform, but the sweat collecting on his temples betrayed the pressure mounting around him. A younger crew member leaned toward him and muttered, "They're calling in Aviation Authority." Derek's jaw clenched. "They'll handle it like always," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Minutes later, a tall man in a gray blazer stepped through the security cordon, flashing a silver badge. His face was expressionless, his hair combed precisely, and a tablet dangled from a sling bag at his hip. "Damon Varon, Civil Aviation Authority," he said briskly. "I need flight logs, security recordings, and all incident reports from Flight 218. Derek stepped forward, trying to control the narrative. There was some turbulence, and one passenger became hostile. Our crew handled it as per protocol. Damon tilted his head. Hostile? Who was injured? Derek hesitated. An infant. But the situation was escalated by the father. "You're missing 15 minutes of cabin footage," Damon interrupted, tapping the screen of his tablet. "From seat row 4. Where is it?" The color drained from Derek's face. "That's probably a sync issue. We'll check the transfer logs." "No," Damon said, voice hardening. "You'll show me everything." Right now, Marcus watched this exchange from a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He stepped forward and quietly held out his phone. "I have the unedited sequence, from the moment the cup was poured to the moment I called for help." Including audio, Damon met his gaze. For a long second, neither man spoke. Then Damon reached for the phone with reverence. "You recorded this?" "They weren't going to," Marcus replied, nodding toward the flight crew. As Damon reviewed the footage, his lips tightened into a thin line. Every moment, Trenton's muttered slurs, Derek's inaction, the punch, the spilled coffee, played back with unforgiving clarity. Meanwhile, Trenton's lawyer arrived, flanked by a junior associate. He was tan, smooth-talking, and dripping with entitlement. "My client is the vice president of Solaire Group, and this entire event is being grossly misrepresented," he declared loudly. "We will not permit this to become a media circus." Marcus turned slowly, lifting the phone in his hand. "That's already out of your hands." The lawyer opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus was already walking. Past the airline officials, past the cameras, past the chaos. He stepped through the crowd toward a man with a press badge standing by the security line, one of the reporters who had been live-streaming passenger reactions. Marcus handed him a small card with a QR code printed on it. "Public drive." "Full recording," he said simply. The reporter blinked, stunned. "Sir, are you sure?" "If truth needs wings," Marcus said softly, "I'll give it flight." By the time the link hit the open web, it spread like wildfire. Phones buzzed, passengers wept, and reporters huddled in groups, scrambling to push out headlines. On Damon's screen, the footage loaded once more, but this time, he watched the reactions. Not from Trenton or Derek, but from the staff, from the crew that had looked away, from the gate agents who had smiled too broadly, from the lawyers now whispering about containment. No one could contain it now. The video captured more than abuse, it captured the moment silence cracked. Where justice didn't scream, it stood up, still, measured, unshaken. Derek tried one last move, stepping toward Damon. "We can explain." The crew was trying to maintain. "You're done," Damon cut him off coldly. "You're not here to explain. You're here to answer." The terminal hushed around them. All attention now on a man who hadn't shouted once since landing. The man whose passport still bore coffee stains. The man whose son whimpered softly in his arms, wrapped in gauze and quiet strength. And as the footage crossed a million screens, Commentary followed, none of it written by publicists. It was a father's silence that told the loudest truth. The flames that burned his son's skin now lit a fire under an entire industry. He spilled his drink, sneered, and struck the child's father, unaware that his cruelty had already sealed his fate. If you believe dignity rises where hate tries to rule, hit subscribe now, because justice always answers in silence. The television screen above Noah's hospital crib glowed with muted urgency. News anchors on every major network replayed the same footage again and again. A crying infant, a burning scream, a calm father resisting the temptation to retaliate. The angle captured Trenton Vale's smug face, the steaming cup of coffee, and the moment gravity betrayed innocence. The headlines scrolled like judgment carved in light. Corporate executive scalds infant on Flight 218. The footage had become a looped reckoning, one man's cruelty broadcast to the nation, and one father's restraint held under the microscope of justice. Outside Solaire Group's mirrored headquarters, the protests had already begun. Men in ties glanced nervously through their high-rise windows as crowds gathered below with handmade signs, "Justice for Noah," "Fire Derek Voss," "Corporate cruelty has a face." What the company had dismissed as an isolated misunderstanding had become a national reckoning. But inside room 302 of Halvern Children's Hospital, Marcus Dellen was silent. He sat beside Noah's crib, his back slightly hunched, fingers rhythmically brushing the baby's soft blanket. The low beep of the oxygen monitor was the only thing anchoring his mind to the present. Noah's legs were swaddled in bandages, pink with healing burns, a reminder of a crime masquerading as accident. Marcus hadn't moved in hours. He had refused every interview request, declined every offer for legal commentary. The media wanted his face. The public wanted his voice. But all Marcus wanted was for his son to stop flinching in his sleep. The door creaked open. Damon Varon entered, clipboard in hand, suit jacket slung over his arm. His usually sharp eyes looked softer now, as if the severity of what he had witnessed had finally caught up with him. "Still no sleep?" Damon asked gently. Marcus shook his head without looking up. "He jerks awake every 30 minutes. Like he's still on that plane," Damon exhaled and stepped closer, placing the clipboard on the side table. "I wanted to give you an update," he said, lowering his voice. "Trenton's been released on bail." Marcus didn't blink. His jaw tightened, a subtle movement that spoke louder than any curse. "His legal team issued a statement," Damon continued. "Emotional provocation. That's the phrase they're using." Marcus finally looked up. "So now it's my son's screams that provoked him?" Damon's lips tightened. "I know. It's grotesque. But there's more." He pulled a tablet from his satchel and tapped the screen. "We traced his coffee purchase." Marcus's brow furrowed. "Didn't he order it from the flight attendant?" "No." Damon turned the screen toward him. He brought it from the Horizon Executive Lounge, right before boarding. A silence fell over the room, not of peace, but of realization. Marcus's eyes narrowed on the screen. The timestamp was unmistakable. The coffee had been bought 20 minutes before takeoff, and worse, it had been logged at nearly 210 degrees Fahrenheit, far hotter than airline safety standards allowed. Damon let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. "We checked with airline safety protocols. Lounge-served coffee isn't supposed to exceed 180 degrees Fahrenheit. This one was deliberately left to steep longer, and there's evidence it was reheated. That means it wasn't just strong, it was weaponized." The word hung in the air like smoke. Marcus stared at the screen, then at his son's bandaged legs. "He didn't just snap," he said quietly. "He planned it." Damon nodded. "We believe so. And if that's the case, we're looking at premeditated endangerment, maybe even felony child assault." The medical monitor let out a soft tone. Noah stirred, his small fists twitching as he let out a soft whimper. Marcus instinctively leaned closer, murmuring softly to calm him, his voice barely above a whisper. Damon stood still, watching the man who had become a symbol, a father who had every right to scream, to strike, to rage, and instead had chosen something far more powerful. "What do you want to do next?" Damon asked carefully. Marcus didn't answer immediately. He looked at the IV drip, the bandages, the red lines across his son's skin. Then he rose slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the city skyline, at the blinking red light atop Solaire Group's tower. Somewhere in that building, Trenton's team was already spinning a new narrative, already calculating risk and PR damage, already preparing to silence and contain. But Marcus wasn't interested in silence anymore. "If they planned pain," he murmured, "then I'll plan consequence." "You're sure about this?" Damon Varon asked as the door to the private airport conference room clicked shut behind him. Renvale nodded once, sharply. "I kept copies of everything. I knew one day someone would come looking." The lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the metal table where 3 men now sat: Marcus Dellon, Damon Varon of the Aviation Authority, and Ren Vale, a lean man with grease-stained fingers and a deep scar across his right temple, earned from years crawling beneath the underbelly of planes no passenger ever thought to question. "What you're about to see," Ren continued, sliding a battered thumb drive across the table toward Damon, "was never supposed to leave the diagnostics bay." Marcus didn't blink. He had heard enough rumors from pilots and engineers over the last 24 hours, but now it was time for proof. Damon plugged in the drive and turned the laptop toward them. A folder opened, time-stamped logs, internal memos, camera feed extracts with blurred metadata, and one file that made Marcus's breath hitch. "OP screen, high-risk behavioral evaluation, first class." "What is this?" Damon asked, already knowing it wasn't standard procedure. Ren swallowed. "Solaire Group's been running psychological stress tests. Not publicly, internally. They're identifying what they call high-risk passengers, not in terms of violence or crime, but demographics, personality profiles, class dynamics." He glanced at Marcus with a mixture of shame and warning. Black men traveling alone with infants, refugees with language barriers, elderly first-time flyers, anyone who statistically might disrupt a flight's premium experience. Marcus's voice was flat. "You're saying my son was part of a test?" Ren's fingers curled into fists. "They call it confrontation mapping. Staff are evaluated on how they respond to engineered incidents. It starts with a provocation, a baby crying, a spilled drink, a delayed request. Then they watch, measure reactions, see who follows protocol and who loses composure." Damon leaned back, jaw clenched. "And Trenton Vale?" Ren's mouth twisted. He wasn't just any exec. He was overseeing the audit. He was the architect of the program. The room fell into a heavy silence. Marcus didn't move. His thoughts were no longer a storm. They were precise, surgical. The burn on Noah's lap wasn't the result of turbulence or an entitled man's rage. It was the opening note in a composition of cruelty. Calculated, authorized, documented. He broke the silence. "Why now, Ren?" "Because the baby screamed," Ren said, "and I realized I've been silent too long." Damon stood, pacing once before turning sharply. "We have enough for preliminary charges, but if we want to make this stick, we'll need corroboration, paper trails, and public momentum." "I'll give you momentum," Marcus said. He opened his laptop, began retrieving the hidden phone footage, interview statements from passengers, even silent nods from airport staff who had overheard whispers but never dared speak. He paused only once to open the message he had retrieved from his own phone's backup sent by Trenton mid-flight to Derek. "Maintain control. No sympathy protocols?" The timestamp aligned precisely with the moment Noah cried out. This, Marcus turned the screen toward them. This is where the mask slips. Upload everything to the cloud, Damon ordered. If they come after us legally, they'll try to scrub the servers first. Already anticipating the move, Marcus opened a secure drive labeled Echo Drop Public Archive. He began uploading each file. This isn't revenge. It's exposure, Wren added softly. They'll come for you now. Not just Trenton. Not just Solaire. The whole network. Their PR firm alone handles half the major domestic lines. Marcus didn't flinch. Let them come. They let a child be burned to gather data. He turned to Damon. When we file, I want both civil and criminal. I want intent. I want conspiracy. I want precedent. Damon gave a slow nod. You'll get it. The following morning, the headlines changed. It was no longer Passenger Causes Disruption on Flight 218. It was Father Files Federal Suit. Airline Used Child in Psychological Experiment. Networks scrambled for footage. Independent journalists picked apart the company's silence. And when the internal messages between Trenton and Derek surfaced, screenshots validated, metadata intact, Solaire Group's board released a panicked, inconsistent statement. But it was too late. Trenton Vale's smirk, once immortalized in boardroom photos and media interviews, had vanished the moment the lawsuit was filed. Now, all that remained were frozen clips of his snarl, his fist mid-swing, his cup mid-pour, each moment immortalized not as an accident, but as evidence. Behind the footage, the voiceover of Marcus's attorney played for the nation. These burns were not just physical, they were systemic. This case is not just about one father. It is about every family forced to stay silent at 30,000 feet. And as the closing exhibit was entered into the public record, Trenton's exact words to Derek, cold and undeniable, Marcus closed the file with a quiet breath. The burn on one child's skin had uncovered the scars of an entire system. Did you silence crew reports under direct order? The question echoed across the packed courtroom like the sudden snap of a fault line giving way beneath a city. All eyes turned to Derek Voss, who sat hunched in the witness chair like a man awaiting execution. The air in the room turned still, heavy, dense, as if waiting with held breath for the answer that might finally unlock a tide of consequence. Derek swallowed. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He glanced toward the long, polished table where Solaire Group's legal team sat in pristine suits, their pens still, their faces unreadable masks. Then he looked at Marcus, at the man whose child had cried out in agony while he had said nothing. Derek began, voice trembling. Yes. I was told not to submit the crew's original incident statements. We were instructed to protect the brand. A low gasp rolled through the courtroom gallery. Jurors leaned forward, visibly shaken. A reporter's pen fell from his hand, clattering against the tile like punctuation. The judge gavelled once, sharply, but the sound couldn't fully settle the disruption. The truth had already landed. Marcus closed his eyes, just for a moment. The burn marks on Noah's skin had never needed translation, but now, finally, someone else had said aloud what he'd known since that flight. That silence had not been an accident. It had been a strategy. Raymond Corin, Marcus's attorney, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his tone unwavering. Mr. Voss, were these instructions verbal, written, or both? Derek nodded slowly. Both. The first call came just before the landing. I was told to mitigate optics. Then an email came in. I can provide it. Please do, Raymond replied, then turned back toward the bench. Your Honor, we request that email be entered into evidence as Exhibit M. Judge Halden gestured approvingly, though his gaze was locked on Derek with a hardened expression of disbelief. So ordered. Across the aisle, Trenton Vale remained still, his posture carved from ice. He hadn't looked at Marcus once since the trial began. Instead, he sat flanked by corporate attorneys, their expressions taut with the knowledge that the tide was shifting. They had hoped to drown this story in legal jargon and corporate decorum, but confession had a sound that cut through suits. Outside the courthouse, protesters held signs that bore Noah's name. Inside, his father held something more volatile than anger: resolve. Raymond turned to the jury. "Let us be clear. This wasn't a misunderstanding." It was an engineered silence. Marcus's mind flashed back to that exact moment on the plane. The heat of the coffee, Noah's scream, the way Derek's face had turned rigid, calculating. He remembered the way the crew had clung to neutrality, even as Trenton smirked from across the aisle. He remembered dipping his passport into the spilled coffee, watching its ink dissolve, a quiet vow to destroy anything that protected cruelty under protocol. Now, here, that moment echoed again, only this time in a room where silence was not allowed to win. When court reconvened after a short recess, the defense scrambled. Solaire's lead attorney, a tall man named Preston Yarrick, attempted damage control. "Mr. Voss may have misunderstood procedural language. Terms like optics and brand integrity do not inherently imply wrongdoing." But the words fell flat. The jury had already seen the footage: the baby's cry, the hand that spilled the cup, the punch, and now a confession that the aftermath had been doctored. When the judge called for adjournment, the gavel sounded more like a warning than a pause. As Marcus stood, his coat shifted slightly, revealing the small envelope tucked inside. Raymond glanced down at it. "You sure you don't want to present that now?" Marcus's fingers brushed against it gently. Inside were the burned remains of his boarding pass and passport, softened, curled by heat, but still whole enough to recognize. Symbols of identity, of belonging, of the moment he chose defiance over silence. "Not yet," Marcus replied quietly. "They haven't earned the meaning." He walked slowly past the defense table, eyes forward, never looking at Trenton. The cameras didn't matter. The stares didn't matter. What mattered was the unshaken hand that had held Noah, the voice that hadn't screamed but endured, and the truth, now breathing in a room that once conspired to bury it. Sometimes truth doesn't roar. It erodes, lies one confession at a time. "Objection," barked the lead defense attorney as Raymond Koren stood up slowly, voice calm but sharp. The courtroom fell into a hush so sudden it seemed the very walls leaned in to listen. The judge, an aging but sharp-eyed man named Halden Rowe, adjusted his glasses and raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" he asked without looking away from Raymond. The defense hesitated. The truth was they had none. They had just played their hand, a risky, calculated move designed to shift the jury's emotional tide. Alden Maris, senior director of Solaire Group, sat smugly in the witness box. His suit was crisp, his voice rehearsed. "Mr. Dellon was aggressive from the start," he claimed, his eyes skating over the jury like a salesman surveying a room of hesitant buyers. "He stood, shouting, and provoked Mr. Vale. Our team only acted to maintain safety. That's all this was, a man losing his temper mid-flight." For a moment, silence held the room in suspense. Even Trenton Vale seemed unsure whether this was the right tactic. He sat several rows back, arms folded, lips tight, watching the jury rather than the man speaking on his behalf. Raymond didn't blink. Instead, he turned to the judge and said, "Your Honor, we respectfully request the presentation of internal messages subpoenaed from Mr. Maris's company account, previously entered into sealed evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." A court clerk moved briskly, loading the file onto the central monitor. The display flickered before settling on a series of message logs. Alden's confident expression wavered as the first message appeared on screen. "Let him react. We need a trigger for insurance liability protection. Alden Maris, 9:43 a.m., 1 hour before the flight. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the courtroom. Another line followed. Control the narrative. Emotions help shift burden away from policy gaps. Alden Maris, 9:57 a.m. Alden's complexion paled visibly under the courtroom lights. His fingers gripped the edge of the witness stand as though bracing for an invisible blow. Raymond took a single step forward. "Mr. Maris," he said evenly, "were you planning to provoke a passenger that morning in order to test how your staff could deflect corporate responsibility?" "No," Alden said quickly, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You denied earlier that you were in communication with flight crew. But this message," Raymond pointed as the next log appeared, "was sent during the flight. Maintain optics. No sympathy protocols. Prioritize de-escalation appearance over intervention." Alden Maris, 10:14 a.m. At the defense table, one of the attorneys put his hand to his forehead, whispering something frantically to another. Trenton leaned forward, squinting at the screen as if willing the words to vanish. Raymond allowed the silence to thicken again before asking, "Is that your writing?" Alden swallowed. "Yes," he admitted, barely audible. "And when you claimed Mr. Dellon was aggressive, you were referring to this moment?" Raymond tapped the screen again. It showed Marcus in the aisle, holding his injured baby, calm, surrounded by panicked passengers, not yelling, not swinging, just standing. The still frame was devastating. "No further questions," Raymond said, returning to his seat. The judge turned his attention to the defense team, eyes narrowed. "Do you wish to redirect?" The lead attorney shook his head slowly, the color drained from his face. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom buzzed with suppressed reactions. Reporters scribbled, camera shutters clicked silently from the back row, and the jury shifted in their seats, no longer passive observers but leaning forward with keen eyes and set jaws. The defense's surprise witness had imploded their own case. Trenton's eyes darted toward the exit briefly, like a man recognizing the tide had turned against him. Damon Varon, seated just behind Marcus, leaned forward, speaking barely above a whisper. "We've got them." Marcus didn't nod. He didn't smile. His expression remained still, measured. Inside, however, a storm of memory, anger, and quiet satisfaction churned. Every sleepless night, every accusation hurled his way, every moment of restraint it had led to this. The trial had shifted, not just in tone, but in gravity. What began as a question of one man's anger was now something far heavier, a reckoning. As the gavel echoed to close the day's session, jurors rose with new purpose in their eyes. For the first time, even the courtroom walls felt less oppressive, as if they too had been waiting for someone to expose the rot beneath the polish. Marcus didn't glance at Alden as the man stepped down, his face ashen, his once proud stride reduced to something slower, unsure. He simply rose, holding his coat over one arm, the faint scent of hospital soap still clinging to it from Noah's bedside the night before. He walked past the defense table without a word, his thoughts steady, his burden lighter. They built their empire on arrogance. He would end it with evidence. The courtroom burst into life the moment the clerk announced the jury had reached a unanimous verdict. Jurors filed back into their seats, solemn-faced, their eyes avoiding the corporate table where Trenton Vale sat still and stiff, flanked by 4 attorneys in sharp suits. Marcus Dellon didn't move. He remained in the front row beside his lawyer, Raymond Corrin, his 6-month-old son, Noah bundled in a light blue blanket against his chest. The warmth of the boy's tiny hand, still healing, pulsed faintly against Marcus's shirt. It was the only thing anchoring him in this moment. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Solaire Group and Mr. Trenton Vale, guilty on all counts." The words fell like a hammer. A ripple moved through the courtroom, a held breath released after weeks of testimony, outrage, and unbearable waiting. The audience of journalists, advocates, and parents leaned forward, as if seeking confirmation from each other that justice had truly spoken. A few clapped instinctively before the bailiff called for order. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts. Trenton flinched, just barely. His mouth opened, but no words came. His lawyer whispered something, but it was too late. The weight of the verdict silenced even the boldest defense. Marcus's fingers twitched around Noah's hand. He didn't cheer. He didn't smile. His jaw remained tight, his eyes forward, as if seeing through the wooden panels of the courtroom wall. This wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a reckoning. Judge Halden, a man known for his measured tone and deep patience, did not rush. He adjusted his glasses, surveyed the courtroom, and spoke with quiet, judicial fury. "This court reminds all corporations that humanity is not a liability," he said, voice steady but stern. "When a child is burned, the brand burns with it." Gasps followed his words, but he did not pause. "Mr. Vale, you weaponized position and privilege. You oversaw a program that stripped people of their dignity mid-flight and punished a man for being a father. You treated empathy as an error. For that, this court sentences you to 10 years in federal custody without parole." Trenton's shoulders slumped. The illusion of untouchability cracked across his face. The judge turned toward the Solaire representatives. "Solaire Group will pay restitution totaling $38 million. Furthermore, you are ordered to implement and document sweeping reforms across all subsidiaries concerning passenger dignity, crew conduct, and internal auditing procedures. Quarterly oversight will be mandatory for 5 years. Failure to comply will invite federal seizure of assets." A loud murmur buzzed through the room. Derek Voss, seated behind Trenton, let out an audible exhale. He looked pale, his collar damp. When called forward for sentencing, he did not resist. Having cooperated fully and testified against the corporate plan, he was granted a significantly reduced sentence, 2 years in a state rehabilitation facility for airline crew misconduct, along with mandatory testimony in pending civil actions. He nodded at Marcus, not as apology, but as resignation. Outside the courthouse, dozens of microphones extended toward the exit, where a storm of press awaited. Raymond looked at Marcus. "You ready for the cameras?" "No," Marcus said simply, shifting Noah in his arms, "but they're ready for this." He stepped outside. Flashbulbs erupted like lightning. Questions flew from every angle, but Marcus ignored them all. He walked forward, calm, even as reporters shouted his name. He stopped only once. "My name is Marcus Dellon," he said, voice firm but low. "This wasn't about punishment, it was about proof." Then he turned and walked away. Across the world, the verdict reverberated. Airlines convened emergency meetings. Aviation boards revisited policy. Solaire Group's stock tumbled. Passengers posted their own stories, and hashtags flooded timelines. # no more silence. # justice at 30,000 feet. # burned but brave. But Marcus didn't watch the news. He was in a hospital room, holding his son's hand. The video that once captured cruelty now symbolized courage. Within days, airlines worldwide reviewed their ethics protocols. One father's defiance had redefined what it meant to protect, not just one child, but all. The glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, admitting Marcus Dellon into the atrium of the Noah Foundation for Passenger Dignity. He walked in alone, the echo of his footsteps swallowed by the vast, sunlit space. The ceiling arched high above, framed with steel beams and transparent panels that allowed daylight to flood through, casting a glow over the polished floors and the banners suspended from above. Each banner carried a word in bold white text: dignity, safety, truth, suspended like silent promises in the air. Reporters were already gathering near the rear, their cameras perched on tripods, microphones poised. A small podium had been set up, But Marcus had already informed the team there would be no speech. He bypassed the media cluster entirely and moved toward the central exhibit, a freestanding display case containing a single framed object. Inside was the passport he had dipped into scalding coffee that day on Flight 218. Its cover was warped and blackened, the emblem partially burned away, but it stood now behind glass like an artifact, not of destruction, but defiance. Damon Varon arrived beside him, his suit still creased from a red-eye flight. His gaze settled on the display, then shifted to Marcus. "You turned pain into precedent," Damon said quietly, his voice heavy with respect. Marcus gave a slight nod, eyes fixed on the passport. "And silence into law," he added, almost to himself. His hands rested behind his back, posture steady. But inside, he still felt the tremor of that moment, the cry that had split the cabin air and the silence that followed, first oppressive, then defiant. The atrium's double doors opened again, this time allowing in a group of men, fathers, uncles, mentors, each leading children by the hand. They paused, taking in the Foundation's clean lines and quiet power. Among them was Julian Maron, the passenger who had once stood up mid-flight when no one else would. He now wore a staff badge and a pressed gray shirt. His eyes met Marcus's across the room, and he offered a nod of quiet pride. Julian had taken up the role of outreach director just weeks before, transforming his moment of courage into a mission of education and advocacy. A photographer approached, gesturing to the frame. "May I take a close-up?" he asked. Marcus nodded. "Let it be seen." The man snapped a few careful shots as a small crowd gathered near the frame, whispering. One man pointed to the scorch marks and murmured, "That's real." "From the plane?" "Every mark," Julian answered for him, stepping forward. "Every mark was the beginning of a change." Marcus drifted to a side corridor, needing a moment to breathe. The hallway was lined with photos, candid ones from airports, families boarding flights, fathers holding sons, pilots helping elderly passengers, moments of humanity reclaimed. He paused at one near the end, a black and white still of himself holding Noah in a hospital room, his son's legs bandaged but his hand resting on his father's wrist. He closed his eyes for a moment. It wasn't just a foundation they had built. It was a shield. Later that evening, Marcus returned home. The house was quiet, warm. The lights were dimmed in Noah's room, the faint hum of a nightlight projector casting slow-moving stars across the ceiling. Noah, now nearly 1 year old, slept soundly beneath a light blanket. His chest rose and fell gently, a small sigh escaping his lips as he shifted in sleep. Marcus crouched beside the crib, his hand resting on the rail. His voice was soft, almost too quiet for anyone else to hear. "No more crying in silence, my son," he whispered. "The sky listens now." He turned to the window. Outside, far above the city lights, a plane moved steadily across the night sky. Its lights blinked in rhythmic sequence, carving a silent path through the darkness. To Marcus, it looked like more than an aircraft. It looked like memory in motion, justice in motion. He stood there a while longer, unmoving. Justice doesn't always soar, but when it does, it leaves a trail no cloud can hide. He tried to scald another man's peace and watched his own comfort burn away. If you believe respect always wins over cruelty, subscribe now. Because justice doesn't spill, it overflows. The story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, humiliation, and the quiet strength it takes to rise above cruelty with dignity. Its purpose is to raise awareness, promote empathy, and inspire conversations about equality, accountability, and self-respect in the face of injustice.